But we are joined by guests today. They are clergy colleagues of ours from the Virginia Conference, and I will let each of them introduce themselves a little bit more thoroughly. For the three of you, if you could just share your name, where you currently serve or have served in the Virginia Annual Conference, and then just a brief word about what it is that brings you to this conversation. What about racial justice work is important to you and to your ministry?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this. I think it's a very important exercise. My name is Benjamin Pratt. I am a United Methodist pastor and then pastoral counselor. I was the founding pastor of the church where Sarah is now the senior pastor, Good Shepherd United Methodist. I was the founding pastor in the 1960s, so that's a very long time ago. In the midst of that tumultuous time, that congregation became a very integrated and a thriving congregation, and of all the things that I've done in my ministry, I may be most proud of that legacy and how it has continued. I then did specific studies, and I was a pastoral counselor for 30 years, and I've been retired now for about 20 years, and I've written 3 books in my retirement, and that's enough from me.
My name is J.P. Hong. If you want to call me by my full name, it'd be Chung Pyo Hong, but JP is perfectly fine. I'm presently in my 3rd year at Christ Crossman United Methodist Church in the city of Falls Church and here in Northern Virginia. As a person who has immigrated to the United States, the context that I've lived when we first landed in Colorado Springs, of many places, and then transitioned to different parts of the U.S., is the experience of, as a immigrant or a person of color, living in what is predominantly an Anglo society in most of the context I've lived, and then making both intentional and by circumstance decisions and choices that's happened that's brought us into different encounters and communities. And over time, just realizing that in the vocation of reconciliation, part of the history and context of reconciliation that I'm very much interested in and we're engaged in, particularly in this time, is reconciliation over the history of the impact of race and the ongoing impact of that. And so that's very pertinent, of course, to a ministry of reconciliation to which the church is called. And that's my passion for it.
Hi, I'm Nickie Moreno Howard, and I am in my 3rd year serving at St. Matthew's in Annandale. And I think I'm called to this racial justice work in my ministry and life because I'm interracial myself, or interethnic. I don't know what the best term is. Since some Latinos are Caucasian, it's hard to say interracial technically, but my grandmother immigrated from Ireland, and so my dad's family is Irish and Mexican, and my mom's family is Mexican, and we're all from here. We're the border crossed us folks, and so growing up in Texas, in a majority Latino community, my whole life, I did not know that the Methodist Church looked differently than singing in Spanish, and living in communities like mine, seeing the rest of the Methodist Church and realizing that it was mostly a white church was a bit of a shock. And I found that out when I was pretty young. And besides coming from a family that has multiple ethnicities and lots of Irish immigrants, I'm married to a Black man, and that means that I had to deal with, in my relationship with him, we have to deal with race. We have to talk about it. We have to be honest and open about it. We have to recognize the privilege that I have because of the lighter color of my skin compared to him, and having a biracial daughter, right? I mean, all of that combined means that the way that I live and move in the world is different. And understanding that and recognizing that and what that helps me to do in my ministry is important. And so I'm committed to racial justice for my family and for myself.
For our 3 guests, how would you explain white privilege, especially to someone who says that they don't understand it?
When the Second World War ended, the GI Bill was created. I was shocked to learn just within the last year that only 4% of the Black soldiers received any of the education benefits from the GI Bill. It was very carefully crafted, and the only way it could pass with the Southern vote was that the GI Bill would not be dispensed via the federal government. It would only be dispensed by each state. So the Southern states very specifically discriminated against the Black soldiers. And maybe even worse in our culture in terms of segregation is the FHA bills, which were implemented by realtors and lenders that mapped out neighborhoods according to skin color of residents. This national housing appraisal system has been commonly called redlining. So those two specific bills that were designed, we thought, to help everyone, have been in fact discriminatory and set up by the people in white power.
And in essence, I think when we talk about white privilege, we're really struggling with trying to come to a shared foundational understanding that actually the historical impact and legacy of racism, that it still exists significantly today in our systems, whether it's our financial economic systems, our governing bodies, our policing, as we're wrestling with through this very difficult year in summer and fall, even in healthcare access as we struggle with COVID. And so I think that's where the conversation gets difficult, because some of us have an assumption that the impact and the legacy of racism still continues today, while others want to simply say it has been dealt with already. And so when I think about a beginning place for talking about the impact of supremacy, white supremacy, and the impact of privilege, it's a difficult slope of trying to talk about historical legacy and coming to an understanding and acceptance that in fact racism has a legacy that is still going on today. And that piece is very difficult. That's just a confession. It's difficult. And so for me, I begin by talking about personal narratives. And so humor often helps. So I say, even me, very fluent English speaking guy who came at the age of 4, entered public elementary right away. When in Colorado Springs, I went to a McDonald's as a junior high kid, and there was a person behind a counter, and I said, I'd like the Big Mac combination, please. She started laughing. And I said, I just asked why she was laughing, not offended at all. And she said, I'm so sorry. To her credit, she apologized. And then she said, I thought you would ask for a Bigger Mac fries and a Coke. So there was an expectation she had simply based on my appearance, my race, perceived race. And so that's where I'll usually begin and say, in less than the threatening ways and harmful ways we've seen white privilege impact people's lives over this summer, can we at least acknowledge that when we look at someone who's different from us, there are assumptions of ability of speech, ability of shared values and commonplaces, assumptions about lower or higher in a kind of a perceived totem of ability and access that we all bring. And we call that bias or implicit bias and all these other terms. But that's where it begins. And where this conversation, I think, continues is to ask, well, those are personal biases, but racism is personal biases that begins to be socially implemented in our rules and laws. And that's going to be the tougher conversation, but that's a beginning place.
If a white person asks me to explain white privilege, my initial response is going to be, I really don't want to. And it's just, I'm exhausted of having to explain why I have less privilege than someone else. The reality is I'm not going to say that, and I will be willing to have the conversation. the best way that I think we can start talking about it is talking about whiteness as default. Growing up, not seeing a lot of white people other than my family, I saw white people on TV. And so that's what I saw all the time. Whiteness is what it meant to be famous, and unless you were playing sports. And so what it meant to be beautiful, the women that I was looking at in magazines in junior high and high school, what it meant to look pretty was to have lighter colored skin and lighter colored eyes and blonde hair, and knowing that I would never look like that. And when we moved to a majority white community for the first time, the awareness of how different I looked is a really good place for me to start talking about white privilege with someone, because simply because of the way I look, right, my privilege is less. And another way to talk about that is to say that many churches that I've served at, the first thing that happens when I go in is they think that I'm there to apply for a custodian job or to work in the nursery. And that's an automatic because I'm Latina. And multiple hotels, people have stopped me while I'm walking down the hall to ask me for something. And I'm like dressed up, like, you know, like an annual conference or something. And I'm like, really, do I look like somebody who's cleaning your room when I'm dressed up and in heels or whatever? And so just recognizing that the way that I look is not the default is a way to think about privilege.
So I want to ask, what are the uniqueness and challenges of bringing this conversation into our context of our current congregation or this Virginia conference or the UUMC in general that is predominantly white, that is 90-something% white?
I think it's important work. It's vital work. And because context is, I think, one of the things that all of us just recognize that we're embedded in, you can't pretend that it's not there. And so to be effective in ministry, to be contextual, which theologically you would use the word incarnational, right? To be truly incarnational, to be as fully present and human and divine as possible, right? That paradoxical challenge, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, you know, kingdom come here on earth. So it's to say that the challenge is real. Demographics plays into that. You do find it easier when there's a greater representation of diversity. And so that is kind of an uphill climb. To have a greater backdrop that is an Anglo population does mean there is perhaps more education that needs to happen, and there's less of circles where people intuitively from their own experience understand terms and experiences. But that's the context we're in.
That having these conversations, recognizing the need to have them, talk about white privilege and identify it and call it out is really risky. And it's really risky when you're doing it in your job, right? And I encountered that as soon as I preached a sermon on racism, and it happened to be in between when we were welcoming a new senior pastor. So one senior pastor had left and the other one was coming in, and I chose to preach this sermon then. And there was a lot of pushback, like a surprising amount, from a community that I think really loves me and from a church that I feel very at home in. And there was a lot of pain expressed when I was calling out some of that. And that would lead us to talk about white fragility. But before we get there, the question that I have to ask whenever we have these conversations, when you have a pastor who is not the ethnicity of the majority of people in their congregation, I think you have to ask if you're the right person to have the conversation with that congregation. I am probably not the right person sometimes to do this work. And what I want and what I need is for white people in any context to take some ownership for learning their own privilege and understanding it on their own. Because a lot of times, especially when we start to talk more about white fragility, my voice isn't going to be heard. It's just not. And I recognize that. And to an extent, I'm okay with it. Like, I'm okay that it is going to be hard for a white person to hear, hey, you really messed up. But they might hear it better from somebody of their own ethnicity, rethink it, and come back.
Whiteness is a pigment of our imagination. I think we have to start with the awful reality that many white people think they don't have a race. They think it's just plain, normal, one against which everything else should be measured. And we have to also acknowledge that in the church, we're in fairly cloistered, segregated reality with people who aren't really too curious about what's going on around them. So in some ways, I'm grateful that white fragility is being disturbed in our time. It may bring us to the opportunity of Pentecost, which is that people of different voices, if they can learn to love each other through Christ, can hear each other. That's what's at the heart of Pentecost. So I'm hoping that the Holy Spirit is in this disturbance that's happening in our country right now, because white fragility is about not wanting to be disturbed.
So to piggyback on what Benjamin and Nickie talked about, this white fragility, and there's some people who think it's just a made-up term that we're using at this time. So if you all could speak on that, it would be helpful.
When I think of the word fragile, sometimes definitions are easier than the opposite. I think about the opposite, and it's resilience. I think about how I want my children to be resilient in specific ways. Resilience not as stubbornness, resilience as a capacity to bear and endure difficult things. And so that's the initial place for me to talk about white fragility. It's to ask the question, is the conversation of systemic racism something that's difficult to be resilient with, to endure, to carry forward into deeper and meaningful substantive discussions, differences even of opinion when it comes to persons of the white Anglo tradition?
Well, I agree with you very much. It is very difficult because when you lock yourself into a state in which you want a minimum amount of stress when it comes to racial issues, you will get afraid. I mean, there is talk, it's become a political reality that white people in some instances feel threatened that the black-brown are going to be the larger population in our country. And in my exchanges with the diversity of people, I absolutely love that. And I'm not only not afraid of it, I welcome it. And I'm very clear, though, that there are many people who do not, because they like to own their superiority and like the privilege that comes from the color of their skin. And it's damn well true that is the way it is.
I actually learned about white fragility growing up in a majority Latino community. And I didn't think of this story until you reminded me of it, Benjamin. When I think about white fragility, I think about someone who is scared and in pain, fearful of losing the privilege that they have access to, someone who is threatened by what they're experiencing, and more than that, somebody who feels like the problem isn't their own. The problem it lies with people of color, and it's on us to correct or resolve. Racism and their whiteness shouldn't have that impact on us, right? We people of color need to be the ones to fix it. And the way that I've experienced it most predominantly is that someone feels that when you call them out on racist behavior, that somehow their own pain and suffering is being denied. And so that's what happened going to school and growing up in majority Latino community. A lot of the white folks in that area felt like, or even that I went to school with, that I was good friends with, really felt like they were never recognized. They were never really part of the community. They were being left out. And it was after a marching band competition that my best friend, who was the drum major, who was white, got all of the white people together from our band. So there was like 400 of us in the band. There were about 20 white people. He got all of them together to take a white picture. And it was like this super intentional thing of recognizing that they were white and that the rest of us were not. And I remember being shocked that that would even happen, and being unaware that he had felt so threatened by the community that he lived in. Like I had no idea that he felt that way. And I remember watching them take the picture, and I told them, I'm 1/4 Irish. I should be allowed in this picture if that's the way you're really going to do it. Like, how many of us are actually white? And like being heckled, like while this was happening. And he had seemingly been like one of us, like with us. He spoke Spanish. Oh, I always felt connected to him and never felt that I never thought that he would experience white fragility or not recognize his own privilege because of where we lived. His family was wealthy. You know, they were all well educated. I thought that he got it. And what was shocking was that he felt so threatened that he had to find a way to push forward how important his whiteness was and the whiteness of the other people in our band who were white also. The person he was when we were in school, he never named how out of place he felt. And because he felt out of place, he thought that he didn't benefit from white privilege. And I've seen that enacted in white fragility quite a bit. Because even though you as a white person felt out of place in a setting, it doesn't mean that you weren't still benefiting from white privilege.
The question that I want you all to kind of share or talk about next has to do with this whole idea of allyship. If you even have any examples of how you feel that white people can help in the process of dismantling racism without harming people of color, I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Interesting to me that Minoo came to me after having worked at Good Shepherd for a year and said, you know, in seminaries, they're talking about this question: how can we really create ethnically balanced congregations? And what did you do back then that made that happen? And I scratched my head and said, I really don't know what I did back then, other than every morning when I got up, I prayed, good Lord, please help me respect every person I encounter. And all I can tell you is I encountered so many wonderful people. It was never a question in my mind that we blended together in a way that was just lovely. There was different leadership positions taken. There wasn't ever the question of, you know, black, white, green, anything about who's going to take these jobs. It had to do with the gifts that the people brought.
I love wordsmithing. If I could go back and change my major, I would have been an English major, right? And so when I think about ally, of course, it's also all lie. We all lie. We lie to ourselves. We lie to our others. We say we're in it together and then pursue our own agendas. That's a contradiction within the word ally itself. Being able to confess. I think confession is critical, especially at beginning junctures and then throughout, right? What Jesus commands us to do, that the table of the Lord is also a table of forgiveness, us forgiving one another as we look across it. We need to routinely confess our agendas, our secret agendas, our hidden agendas, the agendas we didn't know we had, but we uncover it as someone else speaks discomfort to us. That part of being an ally is confession.
When I think about allyship, who an ally is, I have to think about how I function as an ally when I have opportunities to be an ally. And what I've always remembered is that I can't claim that for myself. It's something that I'm granted. I think that's really important. I can try to be an ally as much as I want to be, but I can't call myself that, if that makes sense. And the reason why I wouldn't call myself an ally is because I should be continually working towards that. And the community that I'm trying to be an ally with is the one who names me that. Working with a youth who was transgender and just starting to enter the process, I never called myself a trans ally. That's the way that I was working, but he granted me permission to be an ally. And trying to force yourself into a system and tell people of color that this is how you're going to be their ally is not being an ally. Listening to people of color, seeing what they need, how you can walk alongside them, allowing them to grant you that place as an ally is different and is the way we should do it. And I was thinking about John 4 this morning and the story of Jesus with the woman at the well. And I really felt like Jesus was an ally with this woman. He knew her story, but he went out of his way to go and meet her. I mean, that was not the quickest way to get to where he was going, so he went around and met this woman. Instead of telling her what she needed to go and do, that she needed to be the one to go and share this message of who Jesus is, he allowed her to make that choice to go out and really evangelize on her own. When people questioned him, he stood up for her and stood up for the choices that he was making and having a conversation, learning about her and walking alongside her. I love that story, particularly when we talk about race, because they were people from two different groups working together and listening to one another. And this woman is the one who experienced the major change, but it was because of Jesus's efforts to listen, to be present, to allow her to be herself in many ways. So I just really value that idea.
What are practical and concrete things that people, all of us, right? All of us in all of our diversity, what are things that we can be doing or should be doing? You know, that's always the fun part. You have a conversation like this, and it's great that we all got together and we're talking about this, and that in itself is obviously much needed action. But in your experience and your thinking, what are things that we, especially as Methodist clergy, what are things that we should be doing?
Learning the name of the clerks who check us out at the grocery store so we thank them by name. It has to start small.
To what Nickie was saying, pick up a book, watch a YouTube video, instead of just going back to the state normative. Have enough curiosity to do a word search. If you feel uncomfortable with white privilege, Google search white privilege and just listen to a few voices and see what you think. Do that first step of relating to people and relating to the issue by going one step further.
So for me, there's a book by Austin Channing Brown, I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness. Please read it. I listened to it on Audible. It is the most clear explanation of what it is like to be a person of color in the church. It's like she was in my head. I don't know if the other women of color here feel that way, but oh my God.
And to tag on to the end of that, I think that one of the failures of our Bible studies is that we end up talking history. We don't bring it into how it's related to our present life.
Be remiss if we didn't also point our listeners to United Methodist Resources. G-Corps is doing its 30 days of anti-racism right now. So definitely go check it out. The Board of Church and Society has actually 2 cycles of lectionary that's about helping integrate the Bible to social issues. So that's biblical literacy, y'all. You ought to take advantage of that. And of course, they've done their own seminars on the impact of COVID-19 on existing injustices. So yeah, those resources are available and those are friendly to our own tradition.